Welcome to Feminist Question Time. Women's Declaration International is a leading global organisation defending the women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We're almost all radical feminists here, so possibly the epitome of TERFs. We've been rad fem since the 1970s, and our analysis of gender identity ideology has been consistent since then, so for 50 years. We're not surprised when it came along, and we have not changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which lays out our position, and it's been signed by 38,329 people from 160 countries and is supported by 531 organisations. If you have not yet read or signed the declaration, please do go to the website and do so, and that would be great, and share it with friends or people you know, because the more people who sign it and support this declaration, the more chance we have that we can defend women's sex-based rights internationally. And our speakers today are Sarah Labrys from France, and she's going to talk about the political situation in France, what it means for radical feminism. Then we're going to hear from Mara Accettura from Italy, what's happening at the Careggi Hospital, Centre of Transgender Medicine for Teenagers in Italy. And also she's going to tell us about the surrogacy law, which is passing or is going through the process in Italy. Then we're going to hear from Marina Terragni, also from Italy. And now Mara and Marina are the country contact for WDI, Women's Declaration International, in Italy, and it's great. We'll be hearing from them. Our first speaker is Sarah Labrys, and she is a French lesbian radical feminist and co-founder of Resistance Lesbienne. And she's going to talk about the political situation in France and what it means for radical feminism. So thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on, and over to you.
Hello, thank you for having me on this panel today. I will be happy to bring maybe some clarification for the women who've heard the chaotic situation in France over the past month. We've never been as close to getting a far right-wing government. It's been avoided from very closely, and it's probably only temporary, but yeah, it's been quite of a mess. But yeah, before the talk, I can clarify my positionality, let's say, because I entered the debate on transgenderism from the UK as a lesbian radical feminist in 2017. I've done a lot of work with Get the Allowed. And I've since moved back to France, where I lived, and I co-created Resistance Lesbienne with other women 3 years ago. And my position has always been that trans activism must be fought against from a radical feminist angle, which has always meant for me to categorically refuse any proximity with right-wing and far right-wing politics who can co-opt our themes, especially when it comes to the fight against trans ideology. And I think France, especially like these days, with what's been happening, is really an example of the plurality of traps we must avoid as radical feminists. And I've really felt this plurality of traps also as a lesbian who was in a country that almost almost shifted to a far right-wing government. So yeah, like the patriarchal context of male politics is composed of nuances of male domination and different forces of male domination that compete with each other. And we really feel when we're radical feminists that we do not face a single-headed enemy, but a kind of hydra, like a monster with several heads. And consequently, I have found, especially in the French context, that it's practically impossible to lead single-issue campaign And that includes the campaign for the protection of women's rights against trans activism, because in the context of such a strong force from the far right, we are very vulnerable to being co-opted. And yeah, like the words of Audre Lorde, who said, like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I've really felt it over the past month in France. So I can just take a few minutes to explain maybe what's been happening in France. So after the European elections that we, like all of the European Union countries had early June, the two far-right parties, because in France now we have two far-right parties, we don't have only one, we have two. One is even worse than the other, let's say, but both are terrible, as I'll show you later. So both of those parties, they got almost 40% of the votes, 40%. Like there was a lot of people who didn't go to vote, but out of the people who voted, it's 40% who voted for openly far-right parties. And Macron, the current government, the current president, sorry, his party arrived only second, but really far behind. And so Macron, just in case you don't know, like he got elected in France as a president in 2017, and then again in 2022. Initially he presented himself as a center politician, but yeah, of course, like he ended up like leading a lot of right-wing economic and social policies on a lot of levels. So he's really like center-right, let's say, kind of politics. His party kind of exploded the usual dual, like two-party system, that we had in France, like in the UK, you know, like Tories, Labour. Like the arrival of Macron has completely like exploded the traditional left-wing and traditional right-wing parties. So yeah, like after those European elections, he decided to dissolve the National Assembly, which was a huge surprise for a lot of people. I mean, when I heard that, I was completely like, yeah, flabbergasted, because no one was expecting that. I mean, there was rumors. It's been a while. It had been a while that there was rumors that he was going to do it, because especially since his second election at the National Assembly, he didn't have an absolute majority, which meant that he had to ally with a bit of other parties at Parliament to, especially to vote, for example, the state budget. And voting the state budget is coming in October, and there was some rumors that he was going to do it before that, because he's not really happy that he can't just do whatever he wants. And he was quite sadistic about this dissolution. Like, honestly, like a lot of people and a lot of feminists, like we really felt that we had a kind of psychopathic ruler in front of us, because he said something like about the dissolution of the Parliament, of the National Assembly. He said, like, I threw them a grenade in the legs, and let's see what they're going to do about it. And like this guy, he's coming from the banking industry, and it looks like he kind of played like as if he was some kind of trader, like just trying to play it all at the same time to see if he's going to win or if it's going to break. And just so you can understand more the context, like France is a mix of presidential and parliamentary regime. So the president does have a lot of power, contrarily to many presidents in Europe, who are just like really symbolic role. In France, the president has a lot of power, but also the prime minister as well. And the prime minister, who's the lead of the head of the government, this prime minister has to be of the same political party than the majority at the National Assembly. So this is what is important to understand then why it's quite of a chaotic situation right now in France. Sorry, I have a problem with my document. Okay. So yeah, I mean, like the legislative elections in France, it's like 2 rounds, and it's a winner-takes-all system. So we have a first round with like usually like 4, 5, 6, 7 like runners, and only 2 or 3 the first 2 or 3 who arrive first then qualify for the second round, and then whoever gets the majority of votes for the second round wins the seat at the parliament. So what happened during those legislative elections, like end of June, early July, is that at the first during the first round is the far right who won, let's say, in terms of who arrived first. They got like 30% of the votes, 34% of the votes. So a lot of the candidates of this far right party qualified for the second round, but they didn't win so much for the second round because, as I will explain later, basically like everyone that didn't vote far right for the first round kind of voted against the far right and for whichever candidate during the second round. So that's why the far right didn't get in power really after all. But they still, at the end of those elections, like during the second round, they still arrived first in terms of like numbers of votes, with over 10 million votes for them. And then the left bloc arrived second in terms of like number of votes, but they actually won more seats than the far right or Macron's party. So now we have a National Assembly with the left bloc, which was a coalition of different left parties. So this left bloc has around like 200 MPs, which is a relative majority, but not an absolute majority, because you need 289 MPs for an absolute majority. So it's a very weird situation because the French system has been, like since the 80s, the constitution we currently have has been shaped so the president and the National Assembly are from the same party. But when it's not the case, we call that cohabitation. And in those cases, like there's no really any written rule about what's happening. And also it's even more singular right now, the situation, because the left doesn't have an absolute majority. It won't be able to govern on its own. And currently Macron is just trying to find a way to not nominate a prime minister coming from that left bloc. So we don't really know what's going to happen. Maybe he's going to ally with the right wing, not far right, but the right wing party, or maybe he's going to split the left bloc. We'll see. So yeah, a point about the increasing domination of the far right and the risk for the future from a radical feminist point of view. Okay, I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce the main far right party in France, which is called Rassemblement National. So Rassemblement National it's a new name that has been decided since 2018, but it's just a new name of a decade-old party in France called Front National. And Front National was created in 1972 by a French man called Jean-Marie Le Pen. And so it was created by this guy and a mix of men literally coming from the Waffen-SS, so the military branch of Nazi Germany in the 40s. So there were men coming from Waffen-SS circles, and also a lot of men coming from far-right terrorist groups who were against the independence of Algeria. Because as you know, France used to be a big colonial empire, and there was a very bloody decolonization process for Algeria in the 60s. And a lot of far-right groups in France didn't want Algeria to be independent. And I do have to say, still today, it's a very important line of far-right sentiments still today. You know, like France is still pretty much like hangover from the decolonization, let's be honest. Like there's a lot of racism coming from there. So under Jean-Marie Le Pen, the party Front National had already started to be popular, and this popularity was based on a very explicit and very explicit and traditional far-right rhetoric. So anything you can think about far-right rhetoric, like racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, French nationalism, all of this was very explicit under this Jean-Marie Le Pen. Many representatives of the party, including Jean-Marie Le Pen himself, have been over the decades condemned by the justice for anti-Semitic or racial hatred. But the party has kind of took a new mask since one of his daughter, Marine Le Pen, took the lead of the party since 2011. She developed a strategy of normalization by giving a more professional appearance of the party and by removing the less politically acceptable, parts of the rhetoric. And she instead focused on what's seen as more politically acceptable, let's say, in our Western society and in the media. So she's focusing on immigration and what she calls Islamization of France. She's been representing the party for the presidential elections over the past 3 presidential elections, if I'm not mistaken. And she's been getting more and more success. And yeah, this time there was a new figure of the far right that emerged with a young man called Jordan Bardella. He's been an activist for the Front National for a while, and also he's dating one of the women of the Le Pen family. I can't remember the detail exactly, but yeah, so he's been the figure of those European elections, and he had a lot of success as a man, let's be honest. And also he's been using a lot of social media like TikTok. So yeah, he was really a lot of mainstream media really loved him. So that's for the background. And the increase of the far-right party, like this Rassemblement National, just so you can see, in 2012, during the election, the legislative election, there was only 2 MPs from the far-right party, only 8 when Macron arrived in power in 2017. And now we have 143 just coming from that party, 143 MP, and it gets to a bit higher number with the allies the party had during this election. So the increase has largely taken place during Macron's presidency. I don't have the time to discuss so much in details about what are the factors of this far-right vote, because it's a long discussion to have, but a lot of the rise of the far-right happened during Macron. And it's been very scary how this increase has been very radical and very fast. Just a few years, bam, now we have, the far-right is the first political force in France, let's be honest. And just to add about the chaos that's been happening in France in June is when Macron announced the dissolution of the parliament, during the few weeks of campaign, I do have to say, it's been very scary. A lot of people, and including myself, we really thought that the far right was going to win. And if the far right wins, that there was going to be a kind of civil war, because in France, I think it's not just France, but at least what I know is France, when you put the far right in power, you're not just putting the far right in the institution, you're not giving the institutional power to the far right. In France, we have openly neo-fascist and neo-Nazi militias, so group of armed men in big cities, but also in the countryside, who train, who organize, and even before those elections, they do what we call ratonnade. So, for example, in Lyon, it's very famous that those far right militias, in the night, for example, they go 10, 20, 30 of them, and they try to find some Arabic man or black man or even woman and beat them up. So this was already happening before the elections, but now it's during the election, during the campaign. Honestly, all of the violence you can think of has exploded. And honestly, it didn't, like, the violence didn't come only from the far right. Like, there's been elements of like violence coming from all sides of the political, but a lot of, like, the far right violence has really exploded. There's been an explosion of anti-Arab and anti-Black racism. So a lot of verbal attacks, physical attacks, murder attempts, murders even. A lot of it has been targeted against women, especially Muslim women. A lot of Muslim women have received a lot of physical violence. And there's been homophobic violence as well. Like a leader of one of the main far-right militia, he was involved in the beating up of a gay man, and he was arrested by the police and so on. And he said to the police that he couldn't wait for the far-right party to arrive at government, so then he can beat up some more fags whenever the far-right is in government. And the main far-right party, Rassemblement National, when they've been asked about all this violence, the main representatives, they haven't denounced the violence. They've only minimized or denied, or they just said that they didn't see what was wrong in some of the verbal attacks that's been happening. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more details, but I don't want to take so much time. So yeah, like, what are the stakes for radical feminists in all this chaotic episode? Not just episode, to be honest. Like, this chaotic environment in France. I mean, in France, it's not like the UK. Like, we don't really have an actual, like, gender critical or even radical feminist movement, really. Like, I think it's even worse today than it was a few years ago, because the few groups who've tried to do things in real life in the public space, we've received a lot of violence from trans activists. So some groups have stopped doing public actions. Also, about the far right issue has been very divisive in the radical feminist networks that were existing, because in France, publicly, since a few years, there's only two main women who've talked about trans activism, and they've been very divisive for radical feminists, because, I mean, I'm going to be honest, one of them today has literally publicly on Twitter celebrated the victories of the far right. So, like, those two women who've been very public about criticizing trans activism, they are the only face of the critique against trans activism, let's say, and those women have now completely aligned with the far right. Initially, their argument was that they were using any media who were platforming them. So, because left-wing media was canceling them, then they didn't mind going to right-wing or far right-wing media. And their argument, which I personally even disagree with, but the argument was to say, yeah, like, no one is here to platform us, so we do what we can. But today, it's not even that level. Like, today is, like, one of them, really, she is espousing ideologically all the themes of the far right. She has now even moved away from feminism. And she's even espousing, like, the rhetoric of, like, complementarity between women and men. And she's said a lot of very racist things, openly racist things in general, but also against women of color as well. And yeah, celebrating the win of the far right. So this has been a very big problem for grassroots activists, because, yeah, I mean, on the field, like, I've met a lot of radical feminists who can't be open about criticizing trans activism, but yeah, I mean, on the grassroots level, like all the radical feminists, we disagree with the strategy of those two women of aligning with the far right. Like, we are horrified by it, and of course, like, there's a wider patriarchal context that prevents us from talking publicly about it. But the strategy of these two women have made it even harder for a lot of us to speak or to even organize. Because the theme of the critique of trans activism is now completely seen as a far right thing in France, and it's not just propaganda. Let's be honest. Today, I can't just say it's a lie, because there are facts about it, sadly. So yeah, we are stuck because, of course, the left wing is not satisfactory at all. Like, I'm gonna say it, like, I personally voted for the left wing because in spite of all the problems, I prefer to fight against a left wing government than against a far right government. But the left is terrible. It's been completely co-opted by transgenderism, and it can't be really defended on that side of things, that's for sure.
What impact are the French elections going to have on the European Union?
I mean, if the far right had been elected, it would have been a very big thing on the European Union, because the far right in France, like, today, it doesn't say that it wants to get out of European Union, but it's very like confrontational about especially like social policies and policies around immigration, although European Union is already quite hard on immigration these days, but it's not hard enough for the far right. But also, actually, about the far right, the far right in France, what we can say is that their allies in Europe are Hungary of Viktor Orban, Poland, far right Poland, Italy as well, the far right government in Italy, and all of the European Union like bills that tried to pass in European Parliament about, for example, like condemning Poland about anti-abortion law, or condemning Hungary about anti-homosexual law, or Italy. All of this, the French far right has been like against condemning any of that. So they've shown their true colors on many levels, on the European level.
Right, so Mara Accettura is a journalist. She co-founded Rad Femitalia last year. She writes for the Feminist Post. She works at La Repubblica, where she writes about social and cultural issues. She's not representing La Repubblica views on this occasion. She lives in Milan, has 3 kids and 3 dogs and 2 cats, and she is the joint country contact for WDI for Italy. And the title of Mara's talk is What's Happening at the Careggi Hospital, Centre of Transgender Medicine for Teenagers in Italy. And thank you so much, and over to you, Mara.
Last December, the MP Maurizio Gasparri, who belongs to Forza Italia, which is Berlusconi's party, made an inquiry about the use of triptorelin in Careggi Hospital in Florence. The Careggi Hospital is one of the few centers in Italy who treat gender dysphoria in teenagers. So why the inquiry? He suspected the treatment did not follow the protocol of AIFA, which is the agency that supervised the use of drugs in Italy. So in last January, there was an inspection. It was ordered by the health minister, Orazio Schillaci, and this inspection confirmed the suspicion. Indeed, the hospital did not follow the guidelines, in particular, the presence of a child neuropsychiatrist is highly recommended, but the hospital did not have one, or the one appointed was there only once a month. 2 of the doctors responsible for the service, the therapist Gisca Ristori and the endocrinologist Alessandra Fischer, declare it was not necessary. As we know, the intention or the long-term goal is to demedicalize gender dysphoria. And in particular, Ristori said, we do not ask so-called cisgender people as psychotherapy to define their gender identity. And this should be the same for brackets trans people. The Feminist Post and Rad Fem Italia blog has published the Triptorelin consent form given to these confused teenagers. And Marina Terragni, our president, noticed that this consent form was very biased and prone to gender ideology. It uses asterisks, neutral signs instead of feminine and masculine pronouns, and it uses expressions like assigned gender at birth. It claims that Triptorelin alleviates gender dysphoria, and it's very vague about the long-term effects, which are mostly unknown. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in reality. So the reaction has been really strong. The left is aligned with gender identity. Lots of newspapers attacked the government, saying it's a question of human rights. The parents of gender dysphoric children protested and whinged. The children risk suicide. Triptorelin on dysphoric kids has been used off-label in Italy since 2018. And since 2019, has been funded by the National Health System, so it's publicly funded. But the Bioethics Committee, who authorized the use off-label, recommended the use only in a few selected cases and with a very careful approach, which means only when psychological, psychiatric assessment did not have any effect. We do not know how many teenagers have been given Triptorelin in Italy, let alone hormones. It's a mystery because there is not a centralized system like in UK. We know that at Careggi Hospital in 2022, there were 60 referrals, in 23, 150 referrals. The inspection at Careggi has been pushed by a lawyer, Anna Bernardini De Pace, who was worried about the latent homophobia. She suspected parents were transitioning gay kids, and further talks have been announced. So at the moment, Triptorelin is still being used. The WH path files and the CAS review have not been really reported in the media as it should be, maybe some independent outlet. So this summer, we expect a consultation, we call it a tavolo, where MPs and experts will discuss the correct use of Triptorelin and set the new guidelines through the Bioethic Committee. We hope it will be forbidden for dysphoric children, but we know there are, interests behind. So it will be probably limited, like in the UK, to specific cases and in controlled trials. So that's it. I would like to give you an update about the prohibition of surrogacy in Italy. Some of you will know that we are waiting for a universal ban. The bill has passed the first chamber and it will be discussed in the Senate in September, next September. We expect it to pass, so it should be declared as a universal crime. And this universal ban is supported by a lot of international organizations like Stop Surrogacy Now, CIMS, etc. So that's all. Thank you for your attention.
So we're now going to hear from Marina Terragni. Marina is co-founder of Rad Fem Italia, founder of Feminist Post. She's the WDO, the Women's Declaration International Country Contact for Italy, the contact. She is the chair of the Gender Equality Advisory Council, which is an independent body working alongside the G7 on those issues. And she's going to give Marina welcome and thank you so much. And you're going to give an update on Italy and tell us what's happening. I mean, it's congratulations being the chair of this Gender Equality Advisory Council. It's a really important role that you're playing. And I know you won't be able to do everything, but it's fantastic that you are there at the moment. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and over to you, Marina.
Okay. And so the GEAC, Gender Equality Advisory Council, is an independent body that sits alongside the G7. In essence, it is one of those international bodies where, in addition to deciding policy priorities for Western countries, a great part of work is done on language. And you know very well how important language is for gender politics. Jacob was born in 2018 with the Canadian presidency of G7, and at that time were introduced notes to the text saying that Jack uses the word woman to include all who self-identify as women, including trans and cis women, two-spirits, intersex. This for Canada. Today, things are changed. For the first time, this year, under Italian presidency, of which I'm the chair, there is no reference to gender identity and LGBTQI plus issues. This is the midterm recommendation of a few weeks ago, and we hope it will be possible to maintain this approach also for the final recommendation that will be ready at the end of the year. In this spirit, I accepted to chair the GEAC, whose table is made up of representative from the various G7 countries, as well as some outside experts. For example, I asked to include Lear Keith. Today she's here with us, and Mazi Alinejad, who, as you know, is an Iranian activist living in exile in the United States, and leads a frontline struggle for women's freedom in Iran, but also in Afghanistan and other countries where women's rights are heavily denied or under attack. Each year, the GEAC proposes some pillars, macro areas of work, and 4 macro areas have been identified this year too. The first is the issue of war, and in particular, the very low presence of women at the tables of conflict prevention, mediation, international diplomacy, and even post-war reconstruction. International directives have existed for years with the aim to bridging this gap, but so far these directives have no brought appreciable results. It is therefore a question to understand what is not working and how this equal approach to the issue of conflicts and war can be made effective. A second theme is that of care, which in a way is the opposite of war. There is the destruction here in care is a labor of love. We know that the world has an increasing need for caring relationships, need due to a strong aging of population Western countries, but also the relationship with the environment is definitely a caring relationship. I refer, for example, to climate change. The theme of care, therefore, requires to be placed at the center of policies with investments in human and economic resources. For example, I am having this experience with my mother, incredible and hard experience, who is very, very old, my mother, care is mainly delegated to women. Few men take it on, and this is a big problem. It is therefore a question of identifying new models of care, of shifting resources away from destruction and wars and investing them in caring relationships, of working on a better distribution of the burden of care between men and women, but it is also a question of placing high value on the skills needed for care, a great deal of emotional intelligence, an ability to solve problems, and to adapt from time to time to various situations. In the case of caring for person, research is continuous. It is even a question of including one's caring work in professional curricula as a plus, as an added value, so that it is not, as it is today, a penalizing factor. In any case, here, as in the macro theme of conflicts, I will try to keep the point of sexual difference by speaking only of women and girls. As mentioned, gender identity does not appear in the midterm recommendation that were sent to G7 meeting in Borgognazza in Apulia a few weeks ago. A third theme is Generation Z generation. There is also best-selling texts like the one, for example, by Jonathan Haidt, but also by the one by Abigail Scheel, to tell us that the younger generation is suffering a lot. And are mainly girls and young women who are suffering, with a great increase in cases of mental disorders and even suicide rates, but also with a corresponding increase in cases of gender dysphoria. Above all, Haidt focuses on the invasiveness of social networks and on the violent reproposition of sexist stereotypes, as well as early sexualization with the risk of grooming for prostitution and exposure to online pornography from an early age. We hope in the final recommendation to be able to propose to G7 governments solutions that I would say are quite drastic, such an obligation for big tech companies to introduce devices to prevent access under certain age limits. Another issue related to the new generation is the so-called youthquake in African continent. Soon, the majority of the world's young people will come from Africa, which means investing a large amount of resources in education and training of these young women and men who will make up the world's new recruits in the face of dramatic drop in the birth rate in Western countries. This process absolutely must be governed. And it seemed interesting to us that Italy has launched the so-called Mattei Plan, a plan of bilateral relations with African countries aimed to training these young women and men. Last theme, education. Needless to say, education and training for girls and young women is the most important vehicle for freedom from violence, freedom to build one's own existence, to build one's autonomy, one's economic independence, and to be able to make the choice one wants to make in her life. We know that there are countries in the world where girls do not have access to primary education, starting with Afghanistan, but not only there. We want to draw attention to what a lineage Alinejad calls gender apartheid. I suggested to her to talk more explicitly about sex apartheid, and I hope she takes my suggestion. There are many things to recommend and also symbolic action to take. For example, in Afghanistan, there are clandestine schools, both in presence and online, where brave teachers teach girls and young women. It would be important for Western countries to recognize the diplomas and graduation obtained in these schools as a super education, to recognize their added value and to reward the courage of these women who risk their lives to be able to teach, and of these girls and their mothers who take such great risks for the sake of knowledge and freedom. I would like to add that together with the Minister of Equality in Italiano, Eugenia Roccella, I'm working on a research project on the difference between gender and gender stereotypes, together with the large Italian research institute. My hope is to prove that what we call gender incongruous and gender dysphoria, on which Big Pharma and the whole allied industry make big profits, is instead to be read as a desire to free oneself definitely from gender stereotypes with affirmative affirmative therapy reintroduce narrow gender stereotypes. Every boy or girls who wants to live freely, regardless of gender stereotypes, must be able to do so without turning to this horrible market, without having to deny his or her birth sex. In short, we need to bring back into the realm of subjective freedoms that to which the market and mindless politics are giving commercial answers. The criticism of gender stereotypes was one of the first steps of feminism and must be carried through the end. Everyone must be free to live, to dress, and to behave as they like without being trapped by the market of gender clinics. It is also a matter of giving a political reading of the growing dysphoria among girls. As you know, in 8 out of 10 cases of incongruous or dysphoria, these are girls and young women who want to escape a fate of oppression, who are fleeing from a burning home. I remember a very impressive thing a young transitioner said to me. I didn't want to become a man. I was simply terrified of becoming a woman. If for that 20% of male born who identify as women, the paraphilia key is still valid. In the case of girls, the paraphilia key does not work. Today, the status of the trans issue has radically changed since Yogyakarta. It is necessary to insist on exquisitely political reading and exquisitely political solution to the issue of dysphoria in girls.